So our speaker of today, John Browne, is a former Conservative Member of Parliament who was at one point Vice President of UKIP, the UK Independence Party, the same party that later triggered and won the Brexit vote. He retired as a major in the Grenadier Guards, having served as a pilot and a parachutist. He has a Master of Science from Cransfield Institute of Technology and an MBA from Harvard. A man of many facets. After Harvard, John spent some time as a cowboy on a working ranch in Wyoming, and once he got his working visa, joined Morgan Stanley as an investment banker in New York. He then moved to London with the European Banking Company, where he became Director of Middle Eastern Operations. At present, John is a real estate agent in Palm Beach and is regularly interviewed on television about political, economic, and financial matters. So today, to talk to us about these revolutionaries he has known, may I introduce Mr. John Browne.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and a very happy new year. It's wonderful to see so many sober people so soon after seeing in the new year. I congratulate everybody. Before I begin my talk, I must say I'm one of those, not too many left now of my generation, who finds it hard to turn it on and off my computer. So my computer guru, who's responsible for all these slides that you're about to see, I would like to introduce Michael Martin, Michael really is a genius. He's a former Apple genius, and he's the founder and president of Maxperts, which has a wonderful location just opposite BJ Restaurant on Peruvian. And he is the savior for me and many other people, some I see even in the audience here. Thank you so much, Michael. By those tunes we started with, I saved the British and the American national anthems out of it because I didn't want you to have to stand up, like my father always used to insist on Christmas Day after luncheon when we listened to the King's and then the Queen's speech. He insisted on everybody standing rigidly to attention, even though it was on the wireless. And so I saved you that. Now, it's wonderful to have an audience like this, which is most politicians are very much appreciative of an audience of at least one. And there was one occasion, and I know I've told this story to a number of you in the audience, so I'm going to truncate it, when I was asked to speak at a big financial conference in Hong Kong. And then subsequently, I was invited to speak at a luncheon at the Federal Reserve Board of Philadelphia. And it just fitted in perfectly. London to Philadelphia, give the speech, then the evening flight across the pole to Hong Kong. But unfortunately, there was a hurricane, a tornado, which affected the International Air Terminal in Philadelphia, and all flights were abandoned for that day, so we left a day late. Arrived in Hong Kong, having missed my keynote luncheon speech, and the organizers were not best pleased. So they put me on the last afternoon, on Friday afternoon, immediately after lunch, assuming that one or two people would still be awake, and most we were out shopping in these wonderful shops of Hong Kong. And so, suspecting a minor audience, I went to this lecture hall at about 2:10, and it seated between 3,000 and 4,000 people, and there was not a single person there. It was absolutely empty. And so I was just about to leave, and at 2:20, a single man arrived. Well, he turned out to be the moderator. And just as both of us were about to leave, another single man appeared and slapped smack down in the center aisle in the front row. So I had to give my speech. And he was a marvelous audience of one. He laughed in the right places, clapped in the right places and everything. So at the end of it, I went to thank the moderator, and I walked to go up the central aisle myself. And the gentleman, I went to thank the gentleman for being such a wonderful audience, and then moved to go away. And he said, "Oh, you're not going, are you?" And I said, "Yes, I am. I'm going shopping." And he said, "Well, please don't go." And I said, "Why not?" He said, "I'm the next speaker." So I'm really grateful for you coming. And I was entertaining a couple from Palm Beach at Boodle's Club to lunch a year or two ago, and they sat down, and I'm one of those that feel London's becoming London-stan and really falling apart. But they sat down, and as he sat down in the ladies' side at Boodle's, the gentleman said, "Oh, God, it's so wonderful to be in England. I love it so much. And in London." And I said, "Well, what is it now, with all this deterioration, that's so wonderful about London?" He said, "Well, the wonderful thing is that everyone speaks American." So, anyway, I apologize, first of all, for using the word "I" a lot in this talk. And as a sort of plea in mitigation, I'm just going to read a quote when Tom Wolfe was accused of the same thing. And he replied, "It is based upon personal experiences, most already distant. And I ask, what are we but the sum of all the moments of our lives?" And so this talk is based really on personal experiences with these three people, no great political forecasts or anything like that, but I think you'll get a feel from the speeches. Now, I've left out two people that you might think should have been in here, namely Winston Churchill and President Reagan, both of whom I had the great privilege of meeting. I was in shorts when I met at school, when I met Churchill, but I didn't think anything historic at the time. But now all the older people than me are dying fast, and so I'm now one of the few remainder men who spoke to him. And the reason I left them out is because both of them worked with the establishment, with the swamp. They didn't really try to dissolve the swamp around them and the big establishments of their nations. They worked with them. So they weren't really true, what I would call, revolutionaries. And so these revolutionaries that I've picked out, the three revolutionaries I have, I should say met rather than known, but known at the margin, you might ask, what are they revolting against? And the great struggle that's going on in the world, there are many, many struggles, huge struggles going on, but the major one going on in the Western world is not only desperate, but I would say a mortal struggle between the progressive socialisms and globalism and those people that believe in free markets and nationalism, or nationhood, as it's correctly called, but is now being titled PC-wise nationalism so that it associates with Hitler and everybody else. But that is the really great struggle that's underlying all the other things. And I term these international progressive socialist elite as IPSI, globalists, and they are basically the swamp in both the United Kingdom and in the United States. And the erosion of nationhood, I mean, it takes place in England when it was fine to fly a Scottish, Welsh, or Irish flag, but an English flag, never. Except on St. George's Day. It was always taboo to show any, it looked racist, and all these sort of things that we're taught, these words. And the political correctness started by the Bolsheviks, or by then communists, in the 1920s in Frankfurt. It became known as the Frankfurt Group, and was designed to find out why communism was not spreading faster in Western Europe. It fled the Nazis into New York and then fled to California. And guess what? Where does all the peace emanate from? California spreads east across the United States, across the Atlantic Ocean to London, and then into Europe. And it's designed to confuse, to disorientate, just as communism is. I mean, take, for example, now we used to be quite certain there was a big difference between a man and a woman. And the French cried, "Vive la différence." And we all thought, thank God, when I was at school, there was a great difference, you know. Now we're told we may all be the same, and we can't say a man or a woman. I mean, it's all disorientating. And this is the aim of PC, and that's what we're fighting, and unfortunately, it's been very, very successful. Now, the European Union is the first great experiment of the globalists to get rid of nations, and that's the aim. I mean, Great Britain is going to be split into 11 regions, each reporting directly to Brussels. And so all the nationhood will have vanished. And the importance to the United States is that Britain is the United States' most fervent and with a nuclear deterrent, the most powerful ally of the United States. And if the European Union succeeds in keeping Britain in and the Brexit things in the next few days, America would have lost that ally. And so the globalist step, I call it the Euro-Soviet, because just like the Soviet Union, it has an elected parliament, but gives that parliament no effective power. They talk about power, you can refuse the budget, but only the whole budget, not line by line, so nobody ever refuses. It's run by an appointed commission, not elected, just like the Politburo in the United States. Its courts are very political, and financial corruption is rampant. They haven't had their accounts signed for over 20 years. And, with 2,000 bank accounts, one tends to wonder, why do you need 2,000 bank accounts if it's not to funnel money in various slightly shady directions? So this is very important, and it starts to come out in the open. We had President Macron at the time of the 11th of November Remembrance Sunday having the gall to insult the President of the United States of America, who together with Britain had sacrificed over 1 million dead in the protection and rescue of France, and to start lecturing him against nationhood, which he calls by the PC word nationalism, but that nationhood is bad and it's unpatriotic. All totally confusing. And that was bad enough. But then we have Merkel coming out yesterday, or was on the news, it may have been the day before, with a great message, and the key part of it, it was that nationalism, i.e. nationhood, remains the key threat to the global order. And this is the state. These are very powerful people, particularly Merkel, who basically speaks for the European Union, or what I call the European Soviet. Now, Margaret Thatcher, basically, to sum up her policies, you could sum them up in a single word, for which millions of people have fought and died. And that word is freedom. I first met Margaret Thatcher about 41 years ago when I'd won a primary for a seat in the British Parliament, 1978, and then, of course, the great election of 1979 when she swooned into victory, a major victory. And just as President Trump did in 2016, it depended largely on the fact that she spoke for ordinary people, particularly people in trades unions who felt they were being run and not really democratically. And they wanted the freedom that she talked about and offered. Now, I think apart from freedom would have been her main battle cry and affected everything. Freedom from foreign invasion, freedom before the law, freedom from an overzealous taxman, freedom from trades union, abuse of trades union power. Always freedom, freedom, freedom. And she had great integrity, tremendous integrity, and tremendous fortitude, which was tested in the Falklands, where nobody expected her to do anything. She was a believer in her vision, and totally committed to it. And she delivered on her promises. Now, delivering on her promises for a politician provided a real shock, not only to everyone, but particularly the establishment or the swamp. They could not believe it. And she very cleverly didn't assault the swamp openly. She worked within the swamp to massage and move the swamp, using her power to move the swamp. And this big sweeping victory gave her power, initially at any rate, to move the swamp in the directions a lot of them didn't want to go, but they were forced by persuasion. And she did that, and she also did an interesting, although she was pilloried in the media, just like our president, she courted the media. She used the media and was very well advised by consultants, some of whom I knew, on how to do this. And she did a very good job. She didn't actually take them on head on. She took them on in a sort of underhand way of using them, and not underhand is probably connoting wrong, but a very fair way, but she did it very cleverly. And that's why she kept them sort of on side, although biased heavily against her. Now, people in the rest of the world, even in Britain today, looking back to 1979, cannot remember, cannot believe how socialist Britain was. I mean, you were not allowed to own a telephone. Not allowed to own it. You had to rent it off British Telecom for a third of its value a year in rent. And even the cords from the telephone to the wall were strictly limited unless you were in a big bank in the city or something like that. I mean, it was unbelievably restrictive. And people cannot comprehend today how socialist it was. All the main industries, railways, airways, steel, coal, motor cars, these sort of things were all nationalized. There were one or two on the fringe independent motor car companies, but basically it was all a nationalized thing. And Margaret Thatcher came in, and I never forget the first budget speech. Well, I should go back one on that. The first amazing thing was, of course, the state opening of Parliament. And that was quite staggering to me, because it was, for the first time, you see all these peeresses in their own right and wives of peers come out with these huge tiaras in the House of Lords. I mean, it was really dramatic, beautiful sunny day, and my God, did they glint. It was a fantastic sight. And in those days, members of Parliament wore morning coats for the state opening. Now you're lucky if they wear a tie. And so it was a sudden revival. You thought, my God, this is a new road under Margaret Thatcher. Things are really beginning to happen. And they did. The first budget speech, Sir Geoffrey Howe, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer, came along, and he said income tax, which was then 92%, having been 102% by a mistake, which the socialists corrected and brought it down to 92, was reduced to 60%. I mean, a gasp went up. It was 650 people in the House. It was a loud noise. Foreign exchange controls. When I was a lad, we were only allowed to take £5 a year out of England. So it's little wonder that the English are not good at skiing. And then, by then it was £250 a year, but inflation and all that wasn't really much. And Geoffrey Howe read out, foreign exchange controls, and everyone expected a cut of 10%, 20%, will be abolished from midnight tonight. I mean, these were breathtaking, and literally people sucked in air, and you could hear it as they went through. And then we had, of course, Big Bang for the city, which greatly exploded the ability of the city to take on huge financial transactions. And last year, well, it's now a year a bit, in 2017, Britain's the largest financial center in the world. The United States has the largest common stock market, Japan the second, London the third. But if you take everything, insurance, gold, bonds, everything in, it's the largest financial center in the world. And that will go, too, from its terrifically close ties with New York. And so it will go with, of course, with Brexit. So in she comes. And the first year was terrible. I mean, we fought, and we were up at 2:30, 4:30 in the morning in divisions, and up to God knows when every day, fighting, even in committee stages with all this talking by the left to talk out bills and everything, listening to agony. But it went on, and of course things didn't look too good statistically. We doubled unemployment. I mean, it doubled. And so the press went bananas. And of course, the sterling fell to 104 on an intraday basis from about 135. I mean, it didn't look good. And she, on the back benches, there were rumblings she has to go, because the rhinos, like the Republican in name only in the Conservative Party, which Margaret Thatcher identified as wets, they were already sharpening their teeth and their claws to get rid of her within the first year and a half. And then to the rescue, not galloping, but sort of shambling a little lost over the hill to rescue. It wasn't the 6th Cavalry, but Galtieri. He invaded the Falklands. And of course, nobody considered that Margaret Thatcher would have the guts to react. And I remember being there, the speech went terribly badly. She was looking around for support and things like that from the benches, you know, here, and all. You can't clap. But now they do. It's like a council in England now. But in those days, there was no clapping in the House of Commons, just noise here, and boo, that sort of stuff. And she'd look round for support, and there wasn't very much. when she opened the debate on why we were called back on the first time on a Saturday since Suez in 1956. So it was quite an event already. John Nott, who summed up, made the same speech as he'd rehearsed in the early morning and didn't adapt it for the debate. His whole political career vanished in 30 minutes. He was so beaten down that he had his glass of water on the table in front of him. When he sat down, he couldn't look up for the glass. He had to feel around for the glass. He was smashed in 30 minutes. His whole political career had gone. And so Margaret had an emergency meeting of the cabinet in her rooms in the House of Commons, and the chiefs of staff and the chairman of the chiefs of staff said, well, Prime Minister, now we've gotten rid of this and this aircraft carrier and so on and so on, we can't possibly do anything. And so she dismissed the cabinet, and they sent home for the second time that weekend to their various constituencies all over England. And she drank like that much water in a glass with about 1/8 of an inch of water, that much whiskey with about 1/8 of an inch of water on the top. And she was into her second glass, thinking, well, now she's really going to go. And of course, Lord Carrington had to resign as Foreign Secretary, one of her stalwarts. He'd lost the faith of the party. It was rather interesting. He was brought up in the 22 Committee in room 14, long committee room with a wonderful painting of the Armada, 1558, and some sea captains around it, a huge, great painting, like almost as big as this screen. And he started off pink with embarrassment, and the wall of abuse that hit him from these people, vicious remarks. This is just the Conservative Party, behind closed doors, members of Parliament and things like that, and people from the House of Lords who've been members of Parliament are allowed in there. A wall of abuse so vitriolic that he went white, and it sort of pushed him back. He sort of went back and half fell down in the chair that he'd just got out of. I mean, it was dramatic. And then John Nott, who'd just gone down in the House of Commons, was sitting like this, his hands trembling, trying to shade his face, sitting down on the desk like this, thinking, God, if they do that to the great Lord Carrington, what the hell are they going to do to me? And so he got up to speak, and it was amazing. At that moment, the big horse race had started and was on television, which was on the floor above. So all the people who had owned a horse or a quarter of a horse who had a large wager left the room. And they happened to be the people with the loud voices. And so the whole criticism became very much more muted, and he became quite the minister, saying, I'll take that question over there, and all this sort of stuff. And so he survived, thanks to a horse race. And just like Drake with the game of bowls, and there we had the picture of the Armada standing behind him. I mean, it was quite a historic, 500 years later, quite a historic thing that the British character hadn't really changed in 500 years when you scratch the surface. And so she was sitting there in the committee room thinking this is the end. And then suddenly there was a knock on the door, and Ian Gow, her PPS, Private Parliamentary Secretary, who was a wonderful member of Parliament, murdered in front of his children and wife by the IRA, went to the door, and she said, who is it? And he said, oh, it's the chief of staff. And so she said, show him in. And he sat down opposite her on this huge cabinet table. And she said, what is it, Chief? Having put down her glass of whiskey, second glass. And he said, well, Prime Minister, what I told you in the full meeting of the cabinet and the chiefs was the view of the chiefs of staff. But I myself think differently. What? She said, I can't believe it. So she made him explain. And then she gave the order for the whole cabinet to be recalled again for the second time this weekend from their constituencies, turn around, drive back, this time to 10 Downing Street, where she held the meeting which made the decision to go to the Falklands. And she felt very much that she should have the sort of feelings of elder statesmen. And the real elder statesman was Harold Macmillan, Grenadier Guards, wounded in the First World War, served in the Second World War, and a former Prime Minister. She didn't blow for him to come all the way from Sussex. She got in a car and was driven down there. Quite a long drive before some of these motorways were built, completed. And she went down, and he said, well, Prime Minister, I'm of a certain age, and I've absolutely no reliability in telling you what to do in tactical or things, terms, or anything like that, or strategic terms. You must leave that to you and the Chiefs of Staff and the Minister of Defence. but I can give you one piece of advice, and that is make sure that you form a war cabinet. Maybe maximum 9 people, but preferably 5. And ensure that you always, and I repeat, always have a majority on that committee. So she had herself, obviously, on side. The new foreign secretary who'd taken over was the leading person trying to hatchet her on the back benches, an ex-minister, Francis Pym. And he was definitely a no. He'd taken over from Lord Carrington. The defense minister, John Nott, was a yes. And Willie Whitelaw, Scots Guards, real gentleman, because he was by heart on the wet side, but because Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, he thought it his duty to support her. And she eventually so rewarded him, she made him the last hereditary peer in England and gave him the Order of Merit in the end, several years later. But he was really loyal to Margaret. Now, he was in the Scots Guards in the war. And I'll never forget when my regiment had a battlefield tour, we had the German general telling us about this battle, which came over the hill. And in that battle, the Guards Armour Division, his tank was destroyed, and he was lucky to get out wounded. And for his rehabilitation leave, he was given a driver, a Scots Guards driver, and an American Jeep, and a list of about 300 homes and addresses of all the dead Scots Guardsmen from that attack. And he had to go round each one to the parents of all these 300 Scots Guardsmen. Now, he'd been a scratch golfer in his day and was really quite a lad, but this really turned him. And so there was a big question mark in the research that they go into in England, that, what will happen to Willie Whitelaw, who was a yes, when the body bags start coming back? Would he melt? And so she had to have the 5th person, was Michael Parkinson. And he knew nothing about defense whatsoever, but he was going to vote for Margaret Thatcher regardless. And by sheer luck, he turned out to be a fantastic PR man for it. He was fabulous on television and explaining this whole attack in simple terms. And so she set out and won. And that, of course, was a fantastic thing and rescued her, because then she became a folk hero after the Falklands War, and so all the globalists had to retreat into the ground again or underwater and wait for another good time to attack her. So they retreated, and she went on from strength to strength, became a real international celebrity. And I was lucky enough to get to know her gradually, because I was on the Treasury Select Committee, I was Secretary of the Defence Committee and the Finance Committee. And so always every term in Parliament, you go to see the Prime Minister with your woes and trying to get the thing from the top, the horse's mouth, as they say. And so I meet her on a lot of those. And then I had issues in my constituency. First of all, my predecessor was a lovely man, and he hadn't been knighted when I took over the seat. And she said in the first meeting I had with her, oh, well, he's missed his time window. But I persisted and went on to the 6th meeting. She eventually made him a knight. And so that was 6 private meetings and arguing the toss with her. Then I had a factory in my constituency which was staffed entirely by disabled people with one leg, one arm, one eye, all that sort of stuff. It was started after the First World War to look after the severely wounded people. And the Ministry of Defence bought most of the furniture they made, which was mostly wooden furniture, and they'd started to try to get modern and make metal furniture. So this factory was due to close down. And Margaret bashed the heads of these 2 ministers together in front of me, which was rather embarrassing. And the hospital survived. It was embarrassing, and it breeds resentment. And then the big motorway that was being put through some of the most beautiful countryside in my constituency could have gone a slightly different direction. That was another sort of time. South Africa, she asked me to go down to South Africa to see what was really happening there. And, that she came down, so I reported back to her. And then eventually, Saudi Arabia. She asked me to brief her on. I was sort of considered a Saudi Arabian expert from a banking point of view. And so she asked me to brief her on that. And here should be the letter she wrote. And you can see how appreciative she is. By writing in hand. It was a marvelous paper. I'm most grateful and all that sort of thing. And that's heady stuff for brand new members of Parliament who are just arrived. And the other great breakthrough was that I joined the Lords and Commons Golf Club, which is probably not the finest, but one of the best value golf clubs in the world. The membership fee is £20 a year. And that might be $200,000 in some places or more. But the reason was because we had no golf course. We used to get 200 wonderful invitations from all the best clubs in England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, because they longed to have the Lords and Commons for their centenary match. They loved to have Lords and Commons on their fixture list. And we used to pick the best 20 or so that we thought we wanted to play that year. And so it was fantastic. And I was the second worst player on the team with a handicap of 15. But one with a handicap of 17 was no less than Dennis Thatcher. And so we were constantly teamed together, and occasionally we won on handicap, because our best players were all in single handicaps. We're playing the treasurer, the chairman, the secretary, the champion, who played every day, knew every wrinkle and every green. Whereas we were playing fat, prudent old bankers like me, and we had handicaps. And so occasionally we won. But much more important than the golf, it gave me a sort of back door. He was always very discreet, but you could sort of pick up things from what he was saying, and when I'd ask him questions, he may not answer the whole question, but even the half that he did answer was very indicative. So I had Margaret Thatcher face to face in the House obliquely while she was performing as Prime Minister, and then through the back door, a feel for her from her wonderful husband, to whom she really adored. And that was the thing. And I began to think, as many of her supporters thought of her as the Blessed Margaret. I mean, she really was fantastic. It was such a thrill to soldier under a person with such integrity, such a sense of vision, and such courage. It's one thing to have vision and ambition and all that. It takes the courage is doing it, particularly if you're fighting against the majority, not of the enemy, but of your fellow countrymen in the swamp. And so it was a very interesting struggle, and she started to get a little too grand in the end. She was made this and that, and Europe and everything. She stood up to the European Union, everything, with her handbag. And strangely enough, of course, her statue in the House of Commons, she's trailing this rather large handbag on the statue when she bashed it on the table to confront these Euro leaders of the Euro Soviet. And she was terrific, and she struggled with the European Union, with the media, and then she introduced the community charge. And I have to say, I think she got, which was a sort of universal tax. Instead of rates on your house and property, everyone was going to be charged a certain sort of money depending on their property. It was called the community charge, it was called the poll tax by those who hated it, rather like SDI was called Star Wars by those who hated it. You could tell by the words they used, the PC word, you could tell exactly which side they were on. And that slightly unhinged her, because she slightly arrogantly thought, well, she'll push it through the Commons, which she should have engineered it through the Commons rather than pushing it through. And that caused a lot of, even on the weak, the wet Tory side, a lot of feeling against her. And then she made a fatal mistake on a television program. She was asked by a BBC journalist, well, Prime Minister, a very heated debate, are you going to stand in the next election? She said, yes, and in the one after that. Well, of course, senior cabinet ministers back in their offices thought, my God, if she's going to stand twice, that's going to be, could be 10 years, and I'm already 65. I'll never be Prime Minister. So it stirred up jealousy and anger and mutiny in her cabinet. And she was brought down very similar to the vote. The British Prime Minister is only there with really always 3 weeks' notice. People forget that, because they're not elected personally as Prime Minister by the people. They're elected by their party, their parliamentary party, as the leader, and if they're in power, become the Prime Minister. And that parliamentary members of Parliament can take their leader away and have somebody else, all in the space of about 3 weeks. So they're always living on a knife edge, and that's why Margaret Thatcher wasn't able to take on in open combat against the swamp. She had to massage the swamp and use it for her purposes. And so she was never voted down by the country. She was never voted down by the Conservative Party. She was voted down by members of Parliament in her party, and by one vote. And she was abroad on one of these big international things. That was away from the home ranch. And she then came back, and of course, a lot of her supporters wanted to get to her. They were all barred entry. The swamp came down, sealed her off, and persuaded her, well, Prime Minister, you stand again for the next round, because it has to go to another round. Can you imagine the disgrace if you lose? And she turned, for the only time in her life, really, she turned back and resigned and didn't go for the second vote, which she would have probably won. And she left in tears. It was a very, very emotional time, and it was farewell to the Blessed Margaret, and I think certainly equal to Winston Churchill, and I'm a Churchill fan, but probably better, because what Winston Churchill did was in wartime, and any flying around, flirting with the enemy, he was shot. I mean, in the Second World War, John Kerry would have been shot by Winston Churchill for what he did with Iran, especially going and advising against the government. I mean, there was no question he'd have been taken to the Tower of London and in a matter of days shot for treachery. And of course, with the treachery today, it's all a different story. And so she was gone. And one thing she did before, she did all this in peacetime, which is so difficult, what Winston did in war. So I would say she's the equal, if not better, than Winston Churchill as Prime Minister. They were both, she worshipped Winston Churchill, and I'm sure he would have worshipped her had he known her. It was a very, very sad occasion for Britain and the free world when she was down, but there we are. One of the things she did when she was in power, she made me the escort for Mr. and Mrs. Gorbachev. When they came to England on their first official visit in December the 20th of 1985. Now, it was very interesting because she chose me. I didn't speak Russian. I just studied Russia a bit from a military point of view, but didn't speak Russian. So why choose me? Well, it was the clever reasoning. Well, he's not involved with the Swamp Foreign Office, who will continue to say nothing can be done, nothing can be done. He's an independent mind. And as she'd known me from these various things that I told you about, minor, but if you add them all together, they were significant. And she made me the escort. And what came out later was that the Soviets had realized that President Reagan with SDI was going to break the Soviet Union. The cost, but secondly, the speed of the computers in America would always be ahead of Russian. And the speed of the computer calculation is the decisive action in space war. And so they decided they had to do something. And with a GDP less than Singapore, this huge nation had 11 time zones, and it had a smaller GDP than Singapore, they realized something had to be done. Communism had to change its face. So how are we going to do that? We've got to get someone to negotiate with President Reagan. Who should it be? And Gorbachev was in the Politburo, but not the leader or anything. And so they chose Gorbachev, and they said, first go and try Gorbachev out, and if he fails, another one. But try Gorbachev out on the Iron Lady. See if it works on Margaret Thatcher. So that was the reason for the visit. And it was low-key, because if Gorbachev failed, minimum egg on face. And so it wasn't a state visit, it was a sub-state visit. And I was asked to do the same job as the Foreign Secretary, which is to look after the guest, which was Gorbachev. And I sort of treated it rather casually in the summer of '85 and went to Fisher's Island to play a lot of golf and came back. And then this new season in Parliament, I looked up this old file and I noticed the list of names was a Marshal of the Soviet Union. So I thought, because I never thought I'd be given any big job, but I saw Marshal of the Soviet Union. I thought, this must be quite serious as one of the guests. So I started to get down to it and got myself taught at London University, and that was quite interesting. At the lunch, one of the women lecturers broke down in tears and said, Mr. Browne, I don't think you realize the importance of what you're doing, what you've been asked to do. So it gave me a kick up the backside. And I got more focused, came across to the American State Department, where Brzezinski very kindly interviewed me. And then he said, bring Mr. Gorbachev's CV. And it was a few little lines of type. The rest was blank. And I said, is that all we know about him? He said, this is the joint intelligence from Britain and America, and we know nothing. And we'd like to know if he has children, and if there's which children, which sex the children are. All these were important things to try and get estimate of Mr. Gorbachev. Anyway, here I did my prep, and the last place I went to was the Foreign Office, which I thought was going to be the final fantastic briefing. By then I knew enough to know that they were deliberately misleading me. They were jealous of what I was doing, and therefore they gave me all old-fashioned nonsense. But luckily, I'd done my own research. So they arrive at London Airport, and then Gorbachev and his ambassador went to the embassy for a private lunch, and all the contingent that he had, the Foreign Office laid on this fabulous lunch at a hotel in, not Knightsbridge, but, Kensington. And we went there, and this is the sort of luck of life. I just happened to be put next on place cards to Academician Vlikov, who was the troubleshooter for Chernobyl and was a great astrophysics negotiator for them and salt talks, all that stuff. And the biggest luck was that he spoke fluent English. So we didn't have to go through these awful translators. The British didn't have enough that spoke Russian, so the Russians gave us translators. And they used to spit the words out at us because we were conservatives. They hated us. But so I sat next to the academician, and I noticed he had a black tie on with some red tiger heads. And I thought it looked far too good for a giveaway at an Exxon petrol station. So I said the only other tigers I'd ever heard of was Princeton University. So I said, is that by any chance a Princeton tie? Well, he almost wet his knickers. He was so thrilled. He was absolutely thrilled that someone in England had noticed this tie from America. He couldn't get over it. And so we became great friends, and he just changed his Apple computer to an IBM, which is exactly what I'd done, so we really hit it off well. And because he spoke English, and secondly, he was there not for the stars on his shoulder like the Marshal and the Brigadier and things like that, but because of what was in here, and they couldn't take that away from him. And so he could afford to be just a trifle indiscreet and hidden almost in English mumblings, and it was a wonderful osmosis membrane that I had to learn about what was going on. So we then went, Gorbachev joined us, and we went to Lenin's office. And make sure I don't press the next button or we're all in trouble. Oh God, am I? There we are. And Lenin's office. And this was an amazing thing. There was such a little narrow staircase that you could only go up one at a time. So he went up first and I followed. And I had time to take a photograph of him. When he got to, I thought I had time to get a photograph when he was literally wiping the desk of Lenin with his hands. Because this was like a Christian going to Nazareth and being told this lathe was Jesus' lathe. And saying, oh my God, this is unbelievable to be here and touching it and feeling. And this was Lenin's table where communism began, on this desk. And then other people had come in. By the time I got my camera out, we didn't have cell phones in those days. And I got this photograph, and there's Raisa, his wife, behind him, as more people came up the staircase. But it was quite dramatic. Now he's just looking at it, but he started by just running his hand along the side of the desk. It was really dramatic. And then it began to give me the first inklings of how very important he was, although he was just a Politburo member. Because the chief communists of Britain were all there, of course, and they didn't just show respect, they showed reverence and even fear for this one guy, unarmed and everything. I mean, they could almost be kissing his shoes. And I thought, my God, this guy must be really important. They didn't do that to the Marshal or anything, just to Gorbachev. So I thought, this is it. This is a big guy. Anyway, we then went to the British Museum. The demonstrators were held back behind fences. And we got inside, and the first thing that happened, I was walking right behind him and the curator of the museum. Oh, first of all, we went to the rotunda, and he met a student there from Harvard University. He was absolutely thrilled. This is like leaping across the Atlantic in advance. He was already in America. That was the first thing. Then we went round the artifacts side, and we were going down it, and suddenly I was the curator was here, he was there, and I was one step behind in the middle, and there was a translator by my side. Suddenly, 3 demonstrators lurched out from behind exhibits and yelled, one in English, "You traitor, you murderer, you killer, how many people have you killed this week?" And the others were speaking in Russian and Slavic language, and I'm used to sort of chocolate-coated, soft-scented members of parliament. Suddenly, these rock apes from MI6 or MI5 and the Russian KGB jostled me aside. I was shaking like a jelly, as they rushed past and grabbed these people. They were so strong, and these people were probably druggies. They were all pretty slim. But they grabbed these people. They didn't bum rush them off. They lifted them like this. I mean, I couldn't lift a 5-pound weight like this. And I mean, these struggling bodies were carried up to this room. And we went on our journey, and then we got to the Egyptian department, and we had all these mummies, stone mummies, I mean, out in front, and the hieroglyphics all over them. And when Gorbachev said, and there was a lovely bespectacled curator there with a pince-nez on the end of his nose, and Gorbachev says, "Why has this coffin got no writing on it?" And the chap said, "Oh, sir, that's the most interesting question you could have asked." He said, of course, all these other people were part of the establishment and rich. They could have a stone coffin. This man obviously was not part of the establishment, so he couldn't have anything written on his coffin. But he was rich enough to afford a stone coffin. Well, this to the communist leader was staggering. Anyway, we then went to the Saxon department. He was fascinated to find coins found in Latvia, English coins, Saxon coins and things like that, which reflected the trade. And then, of course, we went to the curator's office where we sat down for a cup of tea. This lovely woman who was the curator of this department said she was summing up, talking about Alfred the Great, and she said, Alfred really was a great king. But the trouble is, most English school children only remember him from burning the cakes. And then Raisa chopped up, most unlike a Soviet wife. Well, you didn't have to do much to be famous in those days. And this was staggering, because normally the women behind these communists sat bolt upright. They sort of poured into a furred coat, and they sat there like this, not uttering no expression or anything. Every time I'd been with Russians, the wives sat behind. The men were pretty motionless, but the women were like statues. And that she would come in and comment like this was amazing, and especially a funny comment. And later that day, she pulls out an American Express card, which stunned me and a lot of other people. Anyway, we went to dinner that night, and to a big dinner, and I had to leave early because I had to vote. And I was in the I lobby of the House of Commons, and the Foreign Secretary comes up to me, Sir Geoffrey Howe, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer, now Foreign Secretary, comes up, just, "John, sit down, come and sit down. I want to hear what you think about this chap Gorbachev." So I thought, and I said, I think he's going to be the next leader of the Soviet Union. He said, "What? He can't possibly," and especially when you say he's got charisma, they're never going to have it. We've got to operate with the nomenclature, the real old Foreign Office, State Department stuff. And he came up. Then Ian Gow comes up, Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Queen, I mentioned before, to the Thatcher, I mentioned before, and says, "John, the Prime Minister wants to see you immediately after the division in her office in the House of Commons." And then a whip comes up and issues this marvellous instruction that goes back. The whips originate from fox hunting, keeping packs of hounds in line, and they're keeping members of Parliament in line. And the cry when they want to hurry you up, I don't know if it ever goes on now, but it did then, "Hounds, gentlemen, please," means get the move on, because we were talking and the lobby was dying away. They wanted us to vote. Anyway, I went in to see Margaret Thatcher after that, and sitting on the sofa, and she was to my left in a chair, and underneath probably the finest portrait of Nelson in the country or in the world, absolutely stunning picture. And she said, "Well, what do you think, John?" And I said exactly what I said before. I think he's going to be the new leader of the Soviet Union. She touched my wrist. She said, "What?" And she said, then, and instead of dismissing it like the others had said, she said, "Why? Why do you think that?" She asked why I thought that, and I told her all this rigmarole as why. She said, "That is most important and most interesting. I want you to brief me each night." That was the end of that. So then the next thing that happened, I was on ABC with Ted Koppel, and he wanted to ridicule what I'd said. And he said, "Mr. Browne, and he's sitting on this stool. And in those days, the satellites came up and went down. You had to get the right time when the satellite was overhead, sort of thing. And anyway, he said, "Mr. Browne, you're enamored by Mr. Gorbachev, Mr. and Mrs. Gorbachev." and you think he's going to be the next leader of the Soviet Union. I said, well, I don't know if enamored's the right word. He hasn't torn up his communist card. And I'm anti-communist. So he said, but I said, the fact is that he and Mrs. Gorbachev have the charisma to be the Kennedy equivalent of the Soviet Union. Well, he almost fell off his stool. He went like this to gain his balance. I mean, that was the end of the broadcast. He didn't want to talk anything about that, mention of the holy name of Kennedy. And then the next day he had me on, and he ambushed me with some farmers from California who'd been on an agricultural mission to the Soviet Union when Gorbachev was just a minister, which is under the Politburo. They're the managers, the Politburo are the directors. And one of them said, Mr. Browne, you're a dirty commie lover. And Ted Koppel says, well, what do you say to that, Mr. Browne? I said, well, it's clearly designed to be very rude, but I said, it's so utterly fatuous. I said, here am I, a Conservative member of Parliament, and a Thatcherite to boot. I said, how much more anti-communist is it possible to get? And that interview ended fairly quickly. And it went on and on. We had these interviews and the thing, and then we took him to various places, to St. Paul's. Then when the others were going off to see Marx's, no, that's right, the main body wanted to see Marx's place and all that sort of thing. Gorbachev and his wife said, no, we're going to St. Paul's Cathedral, a Christian cathedral. I couldn't believe it. And I mean, that was another mark. This guy is the guy. Because if you're in the Soviet Union, you watch your P's and Q's. Every soldier aims his shot. The only person who fires from the hip is the commanding officer. Anyone else has to aim their shots. And so when you're speaking freely like this was just amazing. And the next issue was this, I was on the Treasury Committee, so I wasn't on the Foreign Affairs Committee, but I was invited to the thing with Gorbachev, of course, and I was put right on the extreme right-hand end as a sort of non-entity of the Foreign Affairs Committee, so I wouldn't be confused as a member, right next to the Soviet Marshal, who was like this, and I was here, facing then. Gorbachev was in the center, and Sir Anthony Kershaw was chairman of the, who I used to fox hunt with, strangely enough, was the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And it became apparent from what Gorbachev was saying that SDI was breaking the Soviet back, and they wanted to keep space pure, although they had the first rudimentary weapon systems up there. They saying, we want to keep it pure space, preaching against SDI and things like that. That was the first real indication. Second interesting thing was this Marshal. Gorbachev wouldn't allow any alcohol on this trip. And this chap was obviously vodka drinking orange juice. He was getting pretty bored, and he heard all what Gorbachev was saying about 5 times. So he started to drop to sleep. And suddenly this aide came from Gorbachev, and he sat up, and then he walked to Gorbachev. He was fairly sat up, and suddenly he went to attention like this. And again, these were all little things, but all markers of the weight that Gorbachev had. When a marshal of the Soviet Union leaps to attention, you are someone in the Soviet Union. And these all happened, and that was the big thing. And then it ended, and on the last day I was doing all your morning programs as well, and I was in the middle of the NBC one, and the chap from, it was high tech in those days. The producer was talking to me from Washington. He said, Mr. Browne, we're going to come to you to talk about ABC today, and we're coming at station break, and then we're coming back to you to XYZ. And are you all right? I said, fine. So he said, the first thing we did, and then the second bit, he came immediately. He said, Mr. Browne, are you there? Are you there? And I said, yes. And he said, we're not coming to you anymore because your Prime Minister's just coming out of a private visit with Gorbachev, which was the only meeting I didn't go to of his whole schedule. And so we're going straight over there. And I said, well, as I've been briefing the Prime Minister each night, could I watch? And he said, of course. And this was from Washington. He said, watch camera number 3, I'll turn it towards you. I couldn't believe the technology in those days. Anyway, history of nations goes in great sways of hundreds of years, rich, poor, powerful, weak, and all. And sometimes there's a fault line, and the whole map changes in an instant. And this was one. It was very exciting to be in, because the first question was a journalist from the Times who said, Prime Minister, can you tell us what you think of Mr. Gorbachev? And she said, I think I can do business with this man. Bang! That opened the door to President Reagan. That was the end of the Cold War, the end of the cold phase of the Second World War, and the beginning of the disarmament of the West. And it was a shattering thing. And then I heard in my earphone a producer from Washington, "Are you there, Mr. Browne? Are you there? Are you there?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "We're coming right over to you." And then they wanted to know why I'd thought all these things. And that was when the whole thing changed. Even Ted Koppel wanted to know why on the next broadcast that evening as to what made me think that he was going to be the next leader. Well, of course, he wasn't the next leader. Well, first of all, Margaret Thatcher called me in after he'd left, I think the 22nd or 23rd of December, just before the Christmas break, and said, "John, I want you to, this is so important, I want you to write it down, and I want it on the second day after we come back from the Christmas holidays." And I said, "Prime Minister, what about the skiing?" Well, I just happened to know that she and Dennis were keen members of the House and Lords and Commons ski team, which I skied in. And so she said, "Oh, yes, the skiing," because that ended about 5 days later. She said, 2 days after you come back from the ski. And so a few weeks later, I went to present it, and I sent it to her, the typed out version, and then I was asked to come and present it verbally. And as I left the room, I said, "Prime Minister, would it be all right if I sent a copy to President Reagan?" She said, "Oh, yes, Ronnie will love it, of course, of course." And so President Reagan was in it, and like Margaret Thatcher, and unlike the State Department, he was interested and asked questions. State Department had the same attitude as our Foreign Office. This is never going to change. But Reagan and Thatcher were the two that really paid attention. And it went worse. I was invited over in the January or February time of '86 to give a presentation on this to the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. And they opened, it was at the Waldorf Astoria, and they opened the two ballrooms. It was huge. I mean, there was Walter Wriston of Citigroup and Lindsay of JP Morgan in his front, very costly tables. And we were on a slight dais, not as high as this, a table. And I was asked to debate against Professor Richard Pipes of Harvard, the great Sovietologist at Harvard. And luckily, I sat next to him on this dais. And so we'd had at least a chance to smile at each other and mention the word Harvard, which Nixon had said was the Kremlin on the Charles. So we'd had a chance to try. I got up and I gave my spiel and received a generous ovation. I sat down. Pipes gets up and speaks, and he cuts through my argument like a hot knife through butter. And I ended up as a sort of splodge of molten butter on the ground. He said, and the final thing, when John Browne says Gorbachev's got charisma, they've had enough charisma with Khrushchev. They're never going to have him as the leader. And so he sat down to a standing ovation. And then the chairman, who didn't mean to be cruel, but he said, "Mr. Browne, is there anything you'd like to add?" And I thought, my God. And normally I'm so bad speaking on my feet at these reaction things that balls pass my Swede like golf balls. And I think when I'm driving home, oh my God, I should have thought this and done this. And this one floated in the air. And I thought, this is one you can hit out of the ground, you know. And so I said, "Well, Mr. Chairman, I was very fortunate to have been educated partly at Harvard, where I learned one of the most important lessons in life. And that is, never, ever argue with a Harvard professor." And sat down, they all roared with laughter, and that was the end of that one. So Gorbachev then became leader about a month or two later when Chernenko died. And I was then asked by CNN, they said, "As you know Margaret Thatcher, and you've met President Reagan, do you know who the president of Switzerland is?" Who's only president for 1 year, and nobody outside Switzerland ever knows who it is. And I said, "Well, just so happens he was in the Swiss parliamentary ski team that I skied with for the last 8 years. So I do know him. I've known him 8 years skiing, and we're 10 days training for this race, so that's 80 days. And so they asked me to do the voiceover, which was very exciting for his first meeting in Geneva, when he came down the stairs, you remember, the steps with just a suit on. Gorbachev was muffled up in a huge Russian overcoat with a great scarf and everything. You could hardly see his face. And Reagan comes down, suit, grasped his hand, slapped his elbow, looked quite the leader, and then ushers him up the steps. And that was all great body language. And so from then on, it all went, as you know. The rest of that is sort of history, really. except that, oh yes, President, oh, there he is, sorry, there we are again, sorry. Yes, that's a nice letter that Reagan wrote, which was incidentally going to be auctioned here at the Four Arts. And that's why I was sent this copy of it for hundreds of thousands of dollars. I had no hope of buying it, but they very kindly sent me a copy of it. And then some collector bought the whole collection, so it was taken off the market, and it never was thing, but I just had my copy there. Now we come to the President of the United States. And here I have to be slightly more guarded in what I say, because there may be, I heard the other day there were 3 Democrats in Palm Beach Island. And so I want to be very, very tactful and not causing a lot of trouble here. But I have to say that a lot of people here know him far better than I. It's an extraordinary event, really, because he's taken on, just sort of like Gorbachev took on the whole swamp of his place and turned it around, was a real revolutionary. Margaret Thatcher was a revolutionary, but didn't take on the swamp openly. President Trump has taken it on very openly, plus he's taken on the media. So he's really taken on a huge, huge battle. And the first time I met him was in about the 1990s. Yes, at the end of the 1990s, I was in the pundits of Palm Beach, and I see the chairman sitting here. And Mr. Trump he'd just bought Mar-a-Lago and was arguing about the size of the flag and all that sort of stuff. And we were in a hotel in West Palm Beach, and Mr. Trump was speaking, and I was introduced to him then. That was the first time I met him. And the second time I was asked to be a supporting speaker for him down in Boca Raton. I'm just trying to remember now the group. I was so embarrassed to mention it. Tea Party! That's right. It's a Tea Party rally, and I said most people would be ill. I told everyone to bring sick bags here. But then I was dining in Mar-a-Lago in 2013 with the owner of the newspaper for which I wrote, Richard Mellon Scaife, and there were 3 of us sitting at this little round table, and up comes Mr. Trump then and says, "Do you mind if I join you?" And so he joined us for dinner, and then it was the first time, that was March of 2013, he said, "I'm thinking of running as President of the United States." And we all were very enthusiastic. Excuse me. And so that was the very first. I think I was one of the first, maybe 500,000, I don't know, but one of the first people to hear him say he was running. And then in 2015, in August, I was in the same situation, but this time at one of his golf clubs down here on West Palm Beach, just south of Southern Boulevard. And he comes up and joins us again. And I've met him at various things like the Red Cross Ball, where I was fascinated to see, for the first time, women FBI agents or security agents in long dresses, but with a little headset on their ears, dancing with men in white tie, FBI agents. And I said to one of them, "I bet this is the first white tie engagement you ever had." And he said, "You're absolutely right, it is." And that was sort of fun. And I've shaken hands with him once or twice, but I wouldn't say I really know him, except that I've had 1 or 2 close conversations with him and could sense something about him, which I think, like the vision, like the courage. I mean, most men would have folded by the time. I mean, his is like 5 times worse than the press treatment given to Margaret Thatcher. I mean, most people would have folded on what he's already had from the media, let alone everyone else. And these slightly mutinous people that when they leave their jobs and think it's the best thing to make money is to castigate the president. And it's all very sad. But he's certainly shaken the world in a big way. He's made NATO pay for itself, and he's made the rest of the world realize that if they want to do trade with America, it has to be fair trade, free but fair. And this is against all the teachings and preachings of the swamp. But the swamp in 1944 in July of 44, just a month after the D-Day invasion, a great meeting at Bretton Woods, which established the big beginnings of global government, the World Bank and the IMF. And then eventually, after that, the United Nations. All global stuff, which people from God knows where are telling Americans what they can do. I mean, it's amazing. And these are global institutes, the first great move towards global world government. And of course, the great experiment was the European Union. How do you actually crush these nations and have them all smiling? That's what's so amazing. I mean, most Europeans don't understand what's going on at all. Not at all. Oh, we love the European Union. Of course, all the schools have been heavily propagandized, and the school children, younger generation, the European Union is wonderful. Of course, lots of money has been borrowed and given to them and things like that. And the sports equipment has been bought, and self-writing hurdles for athletics and all that stuff. In my day, you picked up the hurdle and straightened it. Now it's all self-writing, far more expensive, all given by the European Union. In other words, by the taxpayers of these different nations, or the ones that pay tax. And NATO, which was a very successful union, wasn't a world government origin. It was a defense against Soviet Union. And that one has been highly successful. Now the European Union has taken over and said we were the people that kept the peace, not NATO. They forget to mention NATO. So the beginnings of it were all said then, plus the bleeding of the United States, that America was so wealthy. At the beginning of the First World War, Britain was by far the richest country in the world. By the end of it, she was deeply in debt and never really recovered, being really rich. But it's still the fifth largest economy in the world, nonetheless. But after 1945, the Second World War, America was far the richest and most military powerful country in the world. And the feeling was this has got to be distributed. It's got to be distributed to the earth. So all these deals which said, I'll charge you a 5% tariff coming into America, but we'll accept you charging a 25% tariff going into Germany. And all this sort of unfair stuff was all done, some of it with a lot of goodwill to salvage these people from destitution, and also, of course, to protect against communists feeding on poverty. But they had to change, and no one had the courage to change it until President Trump came. Now, I don't know what's going to happen. We're right in the middle of the greatest fight against globalism of all. One, European Union, or Euro-Soviet. Secondly, the future of our president. And I'm a legal immigrant. I'm an American citizen. And so I can say our president. And that's the thing. Now that the House is going to change, the House of Representatives is going to change in power, there's going to be more stuff said against him and everything else. And it's a real struggle. And we have to be really convinced of our cause. Now, most of the globalists are convinced, but it's the people who want free enterprise and nationhood that maybe they're convinced, but they take it for granted that it's going to go on. It is not. We're facing a gigantic struggle in the Western world, and it's centered now on two legs, Brexit and the United States. What happens to our president? Who knows what's going to happen? But this is a real battle. It leaves the Battle of Trafalgar absolutely standing. So there they are, the three great revolutionaries that I selected. Here's an evaluation of how I think they measure up. And these are purely subjective, no science to this at all, just my feeling as to how whether they're person of the people, the people's choice, face national decline, all of them fail. I mean, England was giggling its way into the ocean when Margaret Thatcher came in. Visionaries, central strategy, freedom, courage. They all had to have enormous courage to do what they'd even tried to do. Enormous courage. And the most classic example was Thatcher and the Falklands of the Thatcher regime, that they kept their promises. I mean, this is most unusual in politics, rarity. I mean, historians will scratch around for finding other people who kept their promises for hundreds of years. They achieved their aim. There's a big question mark. I think Margaret Thatcher did. She certainly revolutionized Britain so that free enterprise was allowed to breathe. And the moment it was allowed to breathe, the flame took off. And they were knifed down. Margaret Thatcher was knifed down by her closest associates. Gorbachev was knifed down by his closest people in the swamp. And one's yet to see what's going to happen to our president. There's just one little postscript I would like to add. Nigel Farage, who I worked under, he formed basically the United Kingdom Independence Party, became its leader, and I was a vice president under him. And he was here last week. I had the great pleasure of introducing him to about 3,000 university students at the convention center and having lunch with him and I alone afterwards. Now, he is probably the biggest revolutionary of them all, but nobody's heard of him, or very few. There are 550 million people in Europe, and it's the largest experiment of the globalists yet to crush nations. And if Britain leaves, I would wager it's not going to be the last country to leave. And they're trying to make it as hard as possible for Britain to leave, and as punishing. They want to really punish Britain for even daring to ask to leave. And you have a whole session of prime ministers after Margaret Thatcher Major, globalist, who even takes the trouble to hit me while I'm here in Palm Beach when he comes over. Blair, very charming, great expert, but a great globalist too. Browne, without an E, who was another globalist. And of course May, who voted to remain, I think is a closet globalist, and that's why so dangerous, because she pretends to be fighting for Brexit. But I have my doubts. I don't have any proof that she's not, but I have my serious doubts. So Nigel Farage, if he's successful and Britain gets out of the Euro-Soviet, it'll be, you see the importance of it, 550 million people. If Britain leaves, the second largest economy, they're going to have serious financial problems. Just at the time when finance is starting to cost more and people are beginning to question these debt levels. If Britain leaves, it's going to encourage countries like Italy, Hungary, and Poland. The latter two have just had their voting powers removed by this Euro-Soviet because they're not stepping into line enough. And these are people who left the Soviet to come into the Euro-Soviet. They know what it's like to live under a Soviet regime. And they're rebelling. And these people are going to, now in Brazil, you've got the same sort of thing happening, not against Europe, but the same sort of thing that Trump has unearthed. And this shown people that popular will can count as long as you select the right leaders. And Nigel Farage is one, of which I think of him, if he's not assassinated, you will hear a lot about him in the future. Now you have to watch out. I mean, the globalist elite is very, very ruthless. And so thank you very much for coming.